Remember, we just heard from Josephus that in 168 BC, the Samaritans didn't speak the name of the God of Israel. In fact, they had they referred to God by no name, anonymous, and then they rededicated their temple to Zeus or Jupiter. So that was 168 BC, and now we're being told sometime around 500 AD by Theodoret of Cyrus, that's 700 years later, that the Samaritans pronounce God's name as Yahweh. So where does he get that? So there's a number of possibilities. One is, well, maybe there was some faction of Samaritans who did speak it. I don't know. There isn't really evidence for that. What some scholars suggest, and by the way, this is Gesenius's basis for Yahweh. This statement by Theodoret, what I just read to you, that is the only solid proof of any kind for Yahweh. Is this statement by Theodoret, who's quoting the Samaritans. By the way, Theodoret didn't know Hebrew. The Samaritans weren't even Israelites, so their form of Hebrew was a corrupt form of Hebrew based on the northern dialect, but it was corrupted over time. They don't have the hey sound, for example. This gentleman, the scholar, Samaritan scholar, he says to me, the name of God means Hayah Hia. I said, well, how do you pronounce that in Samaritan Hebrew? Hayah, he says, is Abba. Hoveh, he says, is Ebi. Yehiyah is Yebi. Right, so you can see some remnant there of Hebrew, but their Hebrew is different than the Hebrew that was preserved by the Jewish people. It comes from a different dialect, and that was corrupted over time. So how on earth does Theodoret know what the Samaritans call the God of Israel? So one possibility is that, he heard them say some other word, and he just didn't really, or he heard maybe third or fourth hand, right? Because I doubt he ever met a Samaritan. So somehow the word gets to him that they refer to God as Yahweh or Yahweh. What they might have actually been referring to is what we saw in Exodus 3:14, and other scholars have suggested this, that in Exodus 3:14, we saw that God is called Ehyeh. He says, I am, and then he says, this is what you'll call me for the rest of time, is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, which is he was, he is, he will be. But Yahweh actually would be pronounced in certain periods of history of Greek as Iaveh. Well, Iaveh could be a form of Ehyeh. And that's what some scholars have suggested. This is simply a corruption of Ehyeh and has therefore nothing to do with the Tetragrammaton. Because in this period, the Samaritans didn't even speak the name. There's another possibility, which I find really scary, and it's possible this is true. So, the Samaritans we heard about from Josephus rededicated their temple to Jupiter. Well, what's Jupiter called in Latin? In Latin, he's not called Jupiter. First of all, there's no J in Latin, right? So in Latin, he's called Jupiter. And I actually spoke to an expert in Latin to confirm this. So today in Latin, they say Jove or Jove for Jupiter.
Right.
But in early, and that's where you get in English where Sherlock Holmes says, oh, by Jove, I think I've got it. He's saying, by Jupiter. What are you saying? You're saying by Jupiter. That's what he was saying. Can you believe that? I don't know what the English were thinking back then in the 1800s. But anyway, there's different forms of Jupiter. And I don't want to get too complicated here, but there are different what they call cases in Latin. So there's Jupiter, Jovis, Jovi, Jovum, Jove, Jupiter. But basically in the early Latin, it wasn't a V, it was a W. And so it wasn't pronounced Jove, it was pronounced Yahweh in Latin 2,000 years ago. So now we have this word Yahweh, and where do we get Jupiter from Yahweh? Jupiter is Yahweh Pater, Father Yahweh. That is the name of Jupiter. That was the god of the Latins, Yahweh. And I heard that, I'm like, that sounds awfully like Yahweh. And we know that the Samaritans dedicated their temple to Jupiter, Jupiter of the Greeks. So maybe if you went to a Samaritan and said, what's the name of the god in that temple? He would say to you, that's Father Yahweh, Yahweh Pater. So wait a minute. So maybe this is what they heard from the Samaritans. It's just not the name of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the God of Israel. Now you say, okay, come on. Gesenius isn't going to fall for that. He knew Greek. He knew Latin. He learned Greek and Latin before he learned Hebrew. He was a solid German scholar back then. Even in your day, I think people learned Latin, right? And in the earlier generations, Europeans and people from the West learned Greek and Latin really well. And so he knew about Yahweh being the name of Jupiter. And you think, how could there be any connection between what he said, what Gesenius, this great German scholar of Hebraic studies, said, and Jupiter? Well, he actually admits that there is. Let me read you what he says. And I saw this, and I'm like, there it is. It's a smoking gun. These are the words of Gesenius in his 1857 edition of his dictionary. He says, I suppose this word, referring to Yahweh, and earlier in the paragraph, he says, hey, this comes from the Samaritans, Yahweh, which is Yahweh. I suppose this word to be one of the most remote antiquity, perhaps is the same origin as Jovis, which is Jovis, and Jupiter, meaning Jove and Jupiter, and transferred from the Egyptians to the Hebrews. So, what? So in other words, Gesenius is telling us we have two pieces of information here. We have a name for God from the Samaritans, which is Yahweh, which sounds awfully like, which he believes would originally have been Yahweh, and Yahweh sounds awfully like Yahweh of the Latins. And we have so we have that. In other words, we have this statement by Theodoric connecting it to the Samaritan Yahweh, which he thinks is Yahweh, and we have this Latin god called Yahweh. He says these two things can't be a coincidence. It must be that both the Hebrews and the Latins come from worship some ancient deity who was called Yahweh or Yahweh, and they both then separated into different places. The Latins went to Italy, the Israelites went to Israel, and they both continue to call upon this name with a slightly different pronunciation. The Latins as Yahweh and the Hebrews as Yahweh.
And he's suggesting that it came from the Egyptians?
And it came from the Egyptians, he claims. Now, he wrote this originally in 1833, and that's significant because at that time, they didn't really know what hieroglyphics meant. In other words, they hadn't fully deciphered the hieroglyphics. Mm-hmm. And so you could kind of say anything you wanted about the ancient Egyptians, right?
They did.
And they did, right? Right. I mean, famously, there was, one particular group who said, yes, we have this document in hieroglyphics. Here's our translation of it. Turns out they just made that all up.